Today I'm here as a lawyer, as an expert who has worked in the audiovisual sector and in the electronic communication sector, and as a project leader, a thing that I'm really honored to be, of this twinning project that we're running with INT. And I would like to start by saying that normally, whenever I give speeches or presentations in the countries of the southern Mediterranean coast, I'm usually, being a lawyer, I'm usually addressed with the fact that I quote too many articles and I refer too often to European Commission, to European Union. So this time, I'm trying to have an innovative approach in this speech, and I will try not to quote any article from the European framework, and I will try to refer not only to the European experience, but also to what the European experience can be useful for you in Tunisia. I would like also to thank Mrs. Massaudi for explaining perfectly what is convergence of sectors, etc., so that she gave me the possibility of skipping the first part of my presentation, which is the notion of convergence. And I will move directly to what we refer to in Europe when we speak about convergence of sectors. Convergence of sectors, as Asma said already, is the convergence of two completely different sectors of the communication market, in which the audiovisual content is basically appearing in networks of electronic communications. This is very simple, and it's something that in Europe we started experiencing already more or less in the year 2000. When we started the digitization process of the audiovisual market in Italy and in the rest of Europe, we started to experience a merge of the two sectors in which we were used to having one specific system in which we had broadcasters in the audiovisual framework and network operators, service producers and content producers in the electronic communication sector. With the digitization of the audiovisual sector, what we saw was a merge of those two experiences, of those two types of business models that were present in the two sectors, with the consequence that also in the audiovisual sector, we started seeing different players, and we'll see it in a moment. Now, this seems to be the case already also in Tunisia, in which you are already experiencing this type of convergence. The digitization of broadcasting has already started. You already have a satellite platform, and there are operators which are offering web TV services and IPTV. Today we had a presentation from, I cannot remember his name, and I'm sorry to see that he's not here, but he was explaining us how the streaming HD, how the case of THD is working, and how successful it is in Tunisia. So this is clearly something that is taking place also in Tunisia. What was I referring to when I said that the two sectors are colliding and merging? Have a look at this picture. We are used to the idea that the audiovisual sector is linked to the television, so whatever you see in a television is audiovisual, is broadcasting, and whatever you get in a telephone or in a computer is electronic communications. Okay, nowadays, in the television set, the picture in the middle, you have a number of different types of content coming not only from broadcasters, but also from players who play in the electronic communication sector. Video on demand, web TV, IPTV, etc. All those players do not belong, or at least it's a big question mark to understand whether they do belong or not to the audiovisual sector. For sure, they have clear linkages to the electronic communication sector. I see some of you nodding, so this is something that you're very well aware of. On the other hand, on typical devices of electronic communication sector, of telecommunication sector, such as telephones, etc., you start having content. So the problem now is precisely this, and I'm going a bit forward. The services themselves, they are changing. We have a different offer of audiovisual content on cable, on mobile phones, on internet, etc., etc. Should we consider them telecommunications, or should we consider them broadcasting? This is what Mrs. Massaudi was referring to 1 minute ago, and this is the big question mark that we in Europe started asking ourselves a number of years ago. So, before going to the answers, because what I would like to do with you is try to identify some answers that can be given to this question. There are obviously a lot of good points, a lot of benefits in the convergence. A lot of benefits because convergence so the availability of content in the digital world, allows us to have new services, stimulate innovation, and stimulate investments, which is very good. The fact that Netflix, the fact that Amazon, the fact that all those players are coming to our countries and are investing money is, of course, a direct consequence of the convergence. There are new players, there are more choices for the consumers, which is extremely good because not only there is a pluralism of new choices, but the prices are lower. There are new possibilities for new entrants, and again, the case of THD is an obvious explanation of this. The problems are the typical problems that were already identified by Mrs. Massaudi, which means the problems of vertical integration of the players, and this is something that already in the first session in this morning was identified as a problem. So we have telecom operators who are buying pay TV platforms, and they will start offering all of the services together. For quadruple play players are coming to play. We have a problem with consumers, as said before, and we have challenges for the regulators. Challenges for the regulators that we'll see in a moment. So what did we do in Europe in order to try to answer to this big question? Shall we consider them telecommunications? Shall we consider those services audiovisual? And what can regulators do in order to answer, to take up the challenge? First of all, I move back to this slide here and to what I was telling you before. We have to understand that the audiovisual sector is no more made by broadcasters. In the audiovisual sector, we have now network operators which are running a network, be it satellite, be it internet, be it IPTV, etc., whatever, cable, whatever you want. This is a network. We have content providers, which are basically the old broadcasters. So they are those who create content, or either create or put together content created by somebody else. Basically, those who have editorial responsibility over the channel that is being broadcast. And then we have service providers, those who have the set-top box. You are all very familiar with the idea of set-top box. The set-top box is a decoder, basically, or a box from which you can see all the channels. Now, this is a very important figure that obviously is completely unknown to the previous broadcasting sector, because the regulator will have to take this into account and will have to foster the competition in each of the levels, of those levels of the value chain. So this means has to be careful, has to be sure that there is enough access to the content for the content producers, access to the platform for the service providers, access to the network. How do we do this? With some specific regulation. Now, the problem here is, and I was highlighting this in yellow down there, the problem here is, what is the situation in Tunisia? Mrs. Massaudi, again, 1 minute ago, I'm sorry I'm quoting you so often, but it was extremely important for me to have your presentation before mine because you gave me the lead for those type of reflections with you. You have the INT and you have ICA, which are regulating the two sectors, but there is a huge gray area in the middle that is constituted by satellite providers, content given on satellite, content on internet, content on IPTV, etc., etc. Who is regulating this type of content? Who is regulating not only the content, but the network operators and the service operators in these areas? This is a huge gray area in Tunisia, which is the first thing that should be addressed in the revision of the regulatory framework. So again, Mrs. Massaudi was correctly saying there is at the moment no specific, no ad hoc regulatory framework to manage convergence, this type of convergence in Tunisia. And before her, Mr. Lajmi was saying that there is a need for restructuring the whole framework. This is we agree completely on that. There is a need for restructuring the whole framework, thinking of a bridge between these two worlds that would include this type of regulation, so a regulation that would address the players of the audiovisual sector, these players of the audiovisual sector, exactly in the same way as it is being addressed in the electronic communication sector. I hope I'm clear on this, because this is really one of the key elements of any type of restructuring that you want to have in Tunisia. So I was saying, what did we do in Europe? I promised I will not quote articles and I will not quote directives, because there are a lot, because 15 minutes for my speech would not be enough. I will only summarize the principles. Principle number one, technological neutrality. Technological neutrality means that whatever the channel, whatever the network, it doesn't matter through which network a content is being broadcast, the same rules will apply. In particular, we're not talking about isolated content in general, we are talking about channels. So if a channel is available on terrestrial frequencies, it is regulated because it is regulated traditionally by ICA. But if the same channel is also available on YouTube, and this is what Mr. President Lashmi was referring to before, the same regulation should apply, because we're talking about the same channel, the same service. It doesn't matter whether it is available on a network or another network. So the technological neutrality criterion is one of the pillars of the European framework, and also the Italian and the French, et cetera, in order to regulate convergence. And then we have, of course, a number of authorizations. You call them licenses, we call them authorization for the simple reason that those are not linked to scarce resources. Those are ways to give the possibility to different players to have access to a market in which there are no scarce resources involved, with specifications and different obligations on a case-by-case scenario. So the network operators will have a certain type of obligations. The service providers will have other types of obligations. In general, we're talking about mass carry, quality of service, electronic programming guide, numbering of the channels, et cetera, and of course the content providers will have different obligations. Now, if it is clear that the content providers in the audiovisual sector should be regulated by ICA and monitored by ICA, it is a big question mark to understand who should release the authorizations to the network operators and service providers in the converged sector, and who should identify the obligations. I would tend to imagine that this could be something even more leaning on the competencies on INT than on ICA, but this is, of course, something that will be discussed at political level. Then, another very extremely important point is the idea of content online. Mr. Lashmi before was referring to YouTube and to Netflix. But YouTube and Netflix are two completely different things. Netflix is not a social network, it's a service. Netflix is providing you service on demand. Service on demand means that it is providing you channel on a one-to-one basis, and this is a provisional service which can be regulated. Europe has clearly regulated the video on demand. Of course, the original Audiovisual Media Services Directive was permeated or was created with a two-tier level of regulation. A more invasive regulation for the traditional audiovisual operators and a softer level of regulation for the video on demand. But this doesn't mean that the video on demand is not regulated. Video on demand providers have to notify the activity that they're running, and they have to abide to a number of rules which are clearly prescribed by the directives and by the laws which transpose those directives into national borders in Europe. So I was saying, this is for Netflix. And then YouTube, again, big confusion. YouTube. Well, in case YouTube is reproducing, and this happens very often, not very often, okay, let's say it happens often. In case YouTube reproduces a TV channel, then in this case, I really don't see why we should not treat that channel exactly in the same way in which we treat a channel that is available on television. So the fact that YouTube cannot be regulated has to be seen. Of course, we don't want to go against the freedom of expression. We don't want to create any censorship. This is simply technological neutrality again. So the channel that is being broadcast through YouTube is being broadcast exactly in the same way in which it is being broadcast on television. So the regulations should be the same. And then, again, this was already anticipated, we are experiencing the birth of convergent regulators in Europe, which solve to a certain extent the problem. So traditionally we have audiovisual regulators and telecommunication regulators. In the last 15 years, we saw an increase of the numbers of convergent regulators in Europe. The regulators which came more recently, almost all of them are convergent. Those who have, of course, more experience on the shoulders, instead, they are still separated. But the fact that they are separated doesn't mean that they should not talk to each other. So if there will be a reform of the audiovisual sector and the communication sector in general in Tunisia, which will create a convergent regulator, this will be good. If not, in any case, the idea is that it should be clear who does what without leaving any gray space between the competencies of the two regulators. I have only a few minutes, so I will go very quickly to the latest regulatory challenge. So far, we have spoken about the convergence that has already taken place. Also, another type of convergence, or also another type of challenge is taking place already now, and that's the over-the-top. You have already heard today very often what are the over-the-top. You have already heard that they are acquiring a big portion of the market. What I would like to tell you today is that the big challenge of the over-the-top is mainly for the regulators. Of course, also for the operators, because they are invading the space of the operators. But for regulators, this is a big problem, because everybody, all the traditional operators, are coming to the regulators and are telling us that there is a problem of asymmetric regulation. The traditional operators are heavily regulated, both in telecom and in the audiovisual. The new players, no, for the very simple reason that so far our framework, so our legal directives, our legal instruments are not enough and do not cover the OTTs, so there cannot be any regulation. Now, this means, of course, that if there is no regulation, there is another huge problem for the users. Huge problem for the users because the users, first of all, they cannot, very often in television, they cannot distinguish whether a content is coming from an OTT or is coming from on demand, etc. If I ask my mother, she will never be able to understand who is the service provider that is offering the content. And second, because of course, you have a word and a service that is not regulated at all, and so in which, in theory, there can be hatred speech, there can be violence, there can be whatever you want. And it's difficult to monitor, but even if it's monitored, again, there is a problem of regulation, there is a problem of lack of sanctions, and so basically nothing can be done. So what is the answer that we are giving to this? We have the traditional stakeholders who are asking us to regulate, regulate, regulate. They want the very famous words, level playing field. They want all the rules to be the same for them and for the OTTs. You have the OTTs who are, of course, telling you, well, we are not traditional operators, we don't want to be regulated. So the main challenge for us, all of us, the regulators, is to find the correct balance, which will preserve, from a certain point of view, the freedom of expression, the freedom of internet, if you want, and at the same time, consumer protection and all the other obligations that we spoke about. How do we do this, and what is Europe doing about this? For the first time, in the new draft, I'm not quoting it because it's still a draft and it's probably going to be changed a number of times, but the European Commission came up very recently with a proposal of change, a huge change in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. We are not only regulating the video on demand almost in the same way as the traditional broadcasters. So this is a huge step forward. We are also prescribing some provisions for the video sharing platforms. Video sharing platforms, not the channels in YouTube. YouTube. How do we do this? This is a big question mark, and it's still a big question mark, because at the moment, the directive is asking the member state to intervene, and is giving a lot of space for different types of regulation. We have the statutory regulation, that is the traditional regulation top-down, in which the regulators regulate and the others obey. we have different types of regulation that are now the new model that is emerging and that is basically involving the operators themselves. The self-regulation, in which we ask the operators to create a code that would be able to meet the obligations or meet the general minimum criteria for the protection of consumers, and this can be done by themselves, or, which is the most advanced way, a tool that is named co-regulation. So the regulator and the operators are working together to create a code that would not create problems to any of them. This is what the current revision of the audiovisual framework is planning. I will conclude with only 2 slides on this. We are revising completely the regulatory framework. My commissioner, Mr. Martuscello, before were saying that this process is ongoing. We have a digital single market strategy in which we are revising the whole framework related to communications: audiovisual, telecom, privacy, and copyright. There will be a lot of things to say also on copyright, but we have no time. So in the electronic communication sector, we are basically introducing rules which will apply to OTTs, that are in this case named interpersonal communication services, when they use scarce resources, but also some rules for OTTs which are not using scarce resources, mainly related to security. In the audiovisual sector, the big step forward is the fact that the VOD are being regulated almost in the same way as the audiovisual, as the broadcasters. The content online is being regulated in the same way. The video sharing platforms are included for the first time in the scope of our directive. And again, as I was saying, self and co-regulation tools are promoted. So I will conclude with this, and I will conclude with a focus on Tunisia, just to give you some ideas and some hints. What could be done in here in order to try to use the experience of the European framework, the experience of the European regulators with the revision of the Tunisian framework? First of all, focus very much on technological neutrality. Then try to reduce the gray areas and try to understand who is regulating the content online and the different types of service that are appearing in the new convergence sector. Make a distinction between the network operators, the service providers, and the content providers, so the previous broadcasters, that are now playing in the audiovisual sector, and, but this will probably come later, at a later stage, introduce a regulation for over-the-top players and for social networks using co-regulatory or self-regulatory tools. I hope I was clear. These are all obviously suggestions. For any question, we are open to answer. And I hope I maintain my promise not to be too legal with my explanation. Thank you very much.